Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Felisa Tibbitts, UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Higher Education and Chair in Human Rights Education at the Human Rights Center of Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She also is a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. In this episode, Felisa discusses her personal journey as a human rights education expert and activist, the historical development of human rights education in the U.S., her development of conceptual models for human rights education, and her work in fostering professional development opportunities in HRE. Well, it's a great pleasure to be talking with my longtime friend and colleague, Felisa Tibbitts. How are you today, Felisa?
Bill, I'm doing great, and it's wonderful to see you and hear you in this platform. It's been too long. It's been pre-COVID since we've seen each other, I think.
Yeah, we'll have to change that pretty soon. I'll be coming to New York, and we'll have lunch. How's that?
Sounds great.
So how did you first become interested in human rights issues and subsequently in education about human rights?
You know, I get this question a lot, and it was actually a kind of circuitous route for me. And this is very different, I think, than people I know coming up into human rights education already in graduate school. For me, my interest in what would become human rights began early on when I was a child, growing up in a military family during the Vietnam War and then in the Cold War. And growing up in that environment, being aware of the nuclear capabilities that, at that time, Soviet Union and the US had, I became convinced very early on I wanted to work for peace, actually. So that was the language I used, was working for peace. And when I went into college, I took a course in peace research with Carl Deutsch. And then I realized I could actually study academically an area that I really wanted to work in. So after college, I ended up doing some more peace research in Sweden. That was a time when the nuclear freeze movement happened, actually, in the U.S. and the cruise missile protests in Western Europe. So that was sort of my background for getting engaged in what at that time I was just seeing as peace as a goal, but also in education, because one of the things I discovered after college is that I was well suited to be involved somehow in education in this area. But I really didn't discover human rights, Bill. I didn't learn about human rights in school. I didn't learn about the United Nations. I did Model UN in college, but I really didn't learn about human rights. But the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, as I know you recall. And I went over 6 months later to do some research. Actually, at that time, I was a doctoral student. I was focused on education for democracy. That's how my peace interests had sort of morphed. And I went in and I did a kind of 5-country research tour, interviewing educational elites about how they felt in Central and Eastern Europe, about how they felt their education systems would shift out of Marxist-Leninism into something related to democracy and the market economy. And that research would eventually lead me to be sort of discovered by a human rights group, that the Netherlands Helsinki Committee, which is kind of like the Dutch version of Human Rights Watch. And I was brought in just a couple of years later to help them develop national projects in Central Eastern Europe in the schooling sector where human rights education would come in. And I gave up my dissertation work, started doing the actual work with this human rights group, and my colleagues were all human rights lawyers. So that's how I heard about human rights, how I learned about human rights, and also how I and the political context, the historical moment also introduced me to human human rights as a kind of values frame for schools, moving into traditional justice, into moving into democracy. So that's how I got, and I wish I could say it more shortly, but then but that's the real story. So I discovered human rights in my 30s, literally, but in the context of a very, this historical movement, and I've never looked back.
Well, it's interesting because your sort of discovery of it parallels that of other people I've spoken with, because very few people have had any formal education in human rights prior to actually getting involved as an advocate or an activist.
Well, I think when I'm not surprised to hear that from you, but I will say that one of the things I have discovered over the last 20, 30 years is that people who have been exposed to human rights have increasingly not had that exposure in the law school. And let me explain what I mean. Like 20, 25 years ago, and I still do this exercise. I did it earlier this week. I do this exercise when I'm introducing people to human rights education, especially in non-educators. I just ask them, when did you first really learn about human rights? And I see what people say. And 20, 25 years ago, Bill, almost categorically 100% people learned about human rights in law school, or they hadn't learned about it at all. And now when I offer this question, I really do see more of a kind of spectrum. It's rare, but sometimes it happens in primary school. In secondary school, middle school, happening more now than it used to be. In law school, okay, you still have some people who only learn about it in law school. And I always use that exercise to reflect back to people who have, done the poll, to say, well, if we think human rights education and training is essential for the international human rights movement, what does it mean that you need to go to university to learn about human rights? What does it, this ad hoc nature of learning about human rights is discomforting, and if we are believers in the human rights system or its potentiality, we've got to make sure that everyone gets exposed to human rights education and formal schooling. So I don't disagree with you on what you've observed people to have, like their own lack of exposure, if you will, to human rights until later in life. But I do think for the generation coming up behind us, those generations, I should say plural, it's more likely that they've heard about it earlier in their schooling than university, but it's still highly inconsistent in terms of when people are getting exposed to it, but now more diverse than in the past.
Would you say that it's more common in Europe and in certain other countries in, for example, South Africa or the Philippines than it is in the United States?
I can't speak to the Philippines. I do believe that in Western Europe, generally speaking, it is more likely to have had human rights education either in secondary schools or even younger. So I do think that in general, I would characterize it as more likely in Western Europe. But in the United States, as you know, we're working off of a federalist system. And as a consequence, in some states like New Jersey, where you are, more likely to have probably had human rights in social studies. And there are other states as well that have, for example, a requirement that Holocaust and human rights gets taught. And so there might be then some exposure. So I think in the US, it's harder to characterize it in one way. I think it would depend on the state that you're in.
That sort of leads into this issue of what constitute the obstacles in the United States. For example, Nancy Flowers and David Chiming sort of both pointed to the challenge of American exceptionalism and also the lack of a national infrastructure, you might say, in comparison to Europe, where they have ministries of education. So do you agree with that?
I absolutely think that American exceptionalism is one of the challenges for forwarding human rights education across states in this country. And again, with the state systems versus a national centralized system, then we also have a more complex landscape for trying to influence curriculum. By the way, a side point, another way of seeing our lack of centrality in terms of our education policy is that it gives us more space to promote human rights and human rights education in environments that are more if you will, politically aligned with cosmopolitanism and internationalism. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more complex policy-wise, but if the U.S., if we had that option to even make it required from a central government, from the federal government, it would be more likely to be squashed, I would say, because mm-hmm. of its controversial nature in some places. So I think, practically speaking, it might work best in the U.S. because of our very, at this moment, our binary political environment, to be able to have places where we can continue to forward human rights education. So I don't disagree at all. I do think it is a complex environment. We know that in addition to this, and perhaps related to this U.S. exceptionalism, we have human rights tending to be aligned with progressive or leftist causes and political parties associated with those. So this is another unfortunate, I think, circumstance, I will put it that way, a condition for carrying out human rights education, that it might be, and this happens also in other countries, where human rights is attached with a political agenda, or the political party attached with a certain agenda, and therefore it loses this argument that it's universal, right? Even though, of course, we can continue to make it. So I think also inside the states that party politics is a complicating factor for promoting human rights education. Although, and I will say though, in terms of the point of exceptionalism and American exceptionalism, even though that's historically been true for the states, I do feel like globalization and the trends we're seeing now are going to make it increasingly possible or even desirable to speak about human rights, because, like, even look at climate change, and the nature of some of the problems we're facing now will force the U.S. to work outside of its, if you will, its exceptionalist point of view, and recognize increasingly the need to collaborate with other countries. I mean, not just at the elite level with our diplomats and our leaders, but also, at a more, a sense of connectedness at the local level, at the citizenship level. So I think that global trends, including global crises, will make it easier to overcome this, any proclivities that certain Americans or politicians might have to just leave the rest of the world to itself. I also think there's another condition here in this country bill that actually has been seen both as an impediment, but I see also as a kind of a stepping stone for doing more HRE, and that is our very strong history in teaching about civil and political rights, and our attachment to civil and political rights. So I don't think there's really not a controversy in this country about the importance of First Amendment rights. We hear about it all the time: constitutionalism, civil and political rights. And those of us working in HRE, yourself included over the years, I know one of the things we've wanted to do is to say, hey, human rights is not constituted only by civil and political rights. There's something called human rights that encompasses that, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's been one of the agendas for HRE. But I will say the fact that we're using rights language, civil and political rights language, is that stepping stone for other rights language. So we've seen in the last 10 years, language like the right to housing coming up. We also, during the COVID period, we started seeing the right to health. So I think the rights language is being used more. It doesn't link up with, let's say, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. We haven't signed that in the States. But I do think, and I've seen, maybe you have as well, that there is an increasing use and comfort with, could I even speculate, comfort with using rights language outside of just civil and political rights. So I think that's also a promising aspect of the U.S. landscape right now for HRE.
Well, I think it's interesting that in the 2016 primary campaign, Bernie Sanders consistently talked about healthcare as a human right. And there's a real deficit in the public conversation about the broad range of human rights, in my view. But now I think there are some, sort of, lack of a better term, cracks in that. And there seems to be somewhat more use of that parlance in the public conversation. But at the same time, you've worked as a consultant. you have not only worked in academia, you've been a consultant to governments, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs. So how has that dimension of your work sort of contributed to your deeper knowledge about human rights education, and how does it highlight issues?
So you read my bio. So, yes, I have had the good fortune to work with a lot of organizations and intergovernmental organizations and NGOs. Honestly, it's been wonderful, and I have done different kinds of work with them actually. So it's like Bill, I've done curriculum and resource development. I've done strategy development, policy development. I guess the work that I've done that might be relevant for your question would be the evaluation work that I've done. Because, of course, the idea is that you do evaluation work and it can potentially add to the evidence base, right? That's what we use. That's the language we use, the evidence base for human rights education. So I think there were two studies that I did that I was actually ultimately able to do some publishing on that I think contributed to the HRE evidence base. So maybe I'll just, if I can I describe briefly some of those two studies and what I did? Okay. So one study I guess I'll mention is the one, it was an impact evaluation, but I was able to they, with their permission, to convert it into some scholarship. This was a study I did for a Turkish women's human rights group called Women's Ways. Is that what it was called? WWHR is the acronym. Anyway, they had lots of programming. They were doing advocacy for women's rights, changing the civil and criminal codes, for example. But they had a piece of their work, WWHR's work in Turkey, was a human rights education study group program. Anyway, I did the evaluation of this women's human rights education program. It was an intensive study that looked at the impacts of the program on both the trainers, actually, their engagement in training for human rights, and also the learners. And one of the things I wanted to look at is the impact of how they were doing it, which was essentially critical pedagogy, which we know is really central to human rights education. And what they had also done, those people who designed the programs, they'd incorporated not only the Freirean critical pedagogy, but also ideas that come from feminism, like power sharing and dialogue. So and a lot of it was showing up in the work that they did, and the fact that there was numerous impacts on learners and trainers that were sustained speaks to the power of the pedagogy. So that's one of the results of that study, which was to affirm what we kind of knew in principle, which is that certain kinds of ways of organizing human rights education that was reflective, that was, showing examples from real life, that was challenging learners to think about ways, in this case, they had been made to think about themselves as women in Turkish society, and to make conscious changes in their lives around their new understanding of their being rights holders and women in Turkey. So, and also learning, by the way, about the legal standards in Turkey that protected their rights as women. That was also a piece of this. It wasn't just thinking about human rights in that frame, but also concretely in Turkey, how can you know and claim your rights as a woman, like in getting a restraining order, for example, against a partner. So I think that that research helped to validate, again, critical pedagogy and feminism in terms of how HRE is taught. But I also think that what I had to do as part of that research was to develop a framework for understanding what change might look like, or empowerment. We have that language, empowerment, but like, how do you try to measure that? So I developed a kind of an analytical framework, which of course flowed into both my interview protocols and my surveys around kinds of change, both in the personal domain, like family relationships, as well as in the professional domain, like how human rights was playing out into their work, and also their later engagement in human rights. So I think that framework for empowerment, if you will, or transformation, was one of the outcomes of that piece of work. And I guess if people read my article that I published on the basis of this, they might see ways that they might also be able to measure empowerment. And then if it's okay, should I go on to the other study, or do you have a question about the Turkish?
Go right ahead. No, that's great.
Okay, so the other impact assessment I did was for Amnesty International. It was a 10-country study. And I think what that research showed was how human rights education could be localized. So we have here an international NGO with campaigns going across different sections and structures also, but that ultimately there was also some adaptation, not to the campaign, but certainly localization of the campaign themes to local environments, but also some flexibility for human rights education staff people across these different countries to choose human rights issues of real relevance to their local environment, and to have some human rights education around that. So I think so showing how that localization worked was something that came from that study. Also, I think within Amnesty International, this study helped to show how human rights education helped to make Amnesty International visible in these different country contexts, and also to recruit members. So it showed how HRE could be instrumental for other goals that the organization might have, like recruitment of people. Because you might remember that Amnesty International's way of working traditionally has been that people work on campaigning for political prisoners based outside the country. But many times people are interested to join Amnesty International because of a human rights concern in their own country. And human rights education gave them the opportunity to connect up with Amnesty in doing something in their own home country. So I think that the localization, the value also of HRE within Amnesty International was also something that was shown in this impact assessment. But my last point here, actually, as it comes, I'm thinking about it, is that I also learned something really important doing this research, which might seem a little bit contradictory to what I mentioned about the Turkish research. But what I found in looking across Amnesty International's work in HRE is that even when people were not exposed to human rights education in a way that was very sophisticated, like in the sense of like critical pedagogy and these elaborate exercises that the Turkish women's group had over like 4 months, intensive study in 4 months about women's rights and so forth. Even with more limited exposure, and not all the Amnesty programs were short, but there were many of them that were shorter, certainly than the 4-month intensive program that the Turkish women's group was doing. But anyway, sometimes even with just a very simple presentation of human rights in Amnesty International settings, like a workshop that basically was a little participatory, but essentially just promoting the idea of human rights, it could still have an incredibly motivating effect on people. So even though I'm like really interested in like pedagogy, lots of us in human rights education are super interested in pedagogy and different, and methodologies. But even with very simple methodologies, the power of human rights is also just in this idea that we have human rights. And it allows, in some contexts, especially, I would say, when people have been exposed personally to discrimination, or they've seen human rights violations and they're deeply disturbed by it, getting the language that human rights can help them to name what's happening, to give it new language, but also to name, in this case, a kind of a framework that they can use to claim rights for themselves and to be in solidarity with others. So I was actually surprised how powerful just the language could be for motivating people into human rights activism, even again without this fancy pedagogy. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't try to do, critical pedagogy, but I learned in the Amnesty International study that in certain contexts it was sufficient to get people engaged, just the human rights language.
Well, that's very much a Freirean approach. I mean, that really sort of takes his idea of giving people engagement about their own lives and giving a voice to it as something as basic to helping them move forward in terms of taking control. So I think you're absolutely right. Now, when you talk about the idea of frameworks, you've also been very much at the forefront of identifying conceptual models. And those three conceptual models you mentioned have been used widely in terms of determining emphases, for example, in programs. So What would you say are the key features of those models for our audience, and how has your thinking evolved about them?
Um, Thanks for the question and the chance to address the models. As you mentioned, there are three models, and I maybe I should mention that I developed these in the late 1990s, actually, on the basis of the work I was doing and my colleagues were doing on the ground. So I think I learned later that this is grounded theory, but I didn't have I didn't have that language for it back then. I just felt like something needed to be written about it, because many of us were doing HRE work, but it looked kind of different. So the reason, and it's important for me to, and then I'll get into some of the key features of the models, but not into great detail because people can look it up, I think. But I want to say that the main reason for developing these models was to show two things: that first of all, that there were different approaches to human rights education, that it was in some ways, a very diverse field, and the models themselves helped, highlighted different learner groups, for example, that could be engaging in human rights education, and so these different approaches were pragmatic in terms of the perspectives, like talking about who the learners are, the aims, typical themes, and so forth. But the second aim for developing these models was to emphasize that regardless of which program approach one selected, that human rights education needed to be linked with a wider strategy of social or human rights change, but that we had to be very thoughtful about how our educational programming, whether it was a one-off or a program that went for many years, could contribute to something else in the local environment related to change. And so all the models were embedded in how can this be related to social change, and that was the emphasis. So the three models are awareness, or socialization model, which I'll explain a little bit, professional development, accountability, and then thirdly, transformation and activism. And the awareness socialization model, these are just, these are, I present them as independent, but there's some overlap, and in practice, HRE programs might be mostly embedded in one model, but have aspects of another. So just to say, these are really just archetypes, if you will, to help clarify some of our thinking around different issues like aims. So the awareness socialization model, as the name implies, is around just exposing people to the basics of human rights. So this is the kind of human rights education we typically find in schools, for example, where we have introduction to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the founding of the United Nations and so forth. And the idea here is that the learners are typically students. They might be voluntary or involuntary students of human rights education. Ultimately, the agenda is really to have people familiar with human rights and the discourse. It ultimately legitimizes human rights, I think, if it's done well in a school environment, and legitimize it for a larger culture. So part of the strategy of the awareness socialization model and the rationale for having it in schools, even if it doesn't lead to quote unquote activism, is that it helps, to develop an acceptance of human rights as language that can be used to think about justice and to think about rights in a broad way. So the second model is called the professional development or accountability model. And this one, Bill, is, as it may seem self-evident, is focused on the relationship between human rights standards and values and people in the workplace, in their professional careers, whatever they're doing. And as opposed to the awareness socialization model, which is sort of like the basics of human rights and normalizing the human rights discourse, at least to some degree, in the school setting, the professional development one is focused on the practical application of human rights to the roles and responsibilities of whatever job or career you have, whether you're a law enforcement official, a teacher, a social worker, and to tease out also sort of what's the same and what's different between human rights and any professional standards they have, codes of ethics, that are also out there to give them some guidance in terms of ethics. So there are situations where, for example, the human rights standards might be higher in terms of the responsibilities of a professional in doing the work, and it might supersede maybe laws. And I'll be specific. For example, there are some social workers in countries that have accepted asylum seekers who have been prohibited legally from giving, administering their social work services to undocumented persons because of their illegal status. But from the human rights perspective, we would say that those undocumented persons still have a right to those social services. So there are still these situations where there is a disjuncture. So anyway, the professional development accountability model is one. And again, I can speak about what kind of content might be in this that's very specific to professional development. For example, the history of various professions from a human rights perspective, like the ways in which even in psychology, psychology and psychological sciences have been used to validate eugenics in the past. So partly it's also looking at your profession from a human rights lens, in addition to thinking about, okay, practically speaking, how might human rights influence decisions I make about how I carry out my work? The final model is called the transformation or activist model. This is very popular because it sort of links up with our excitement about trying to make a change. So this particular model, it's again, maybe self-evident, is focused on human rights learning to help capacitate people to get engaged in social change efforts. And to really, so that's, again, very distinct from these other two. And I did change these models a little bit when I was asked to revisit them. Would you like me to talk to you about how they've changed over time, or do you have a question for me before I move on?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so these models were worked on in the late 1990s, and they have these different like typical learner groups, typical themes that are taken up, and a few other, and how this particular kind of human rights education is linked up with a strategy of social change. It was very kind of programmatically oriented because that's also where my head was at. And a few years ago, actually, Monisha Bajaj invited me to write something for her. And I thought, I'm going to revisit those models and see what might be different now, given the 20 years that have passed since I first worked on these. And the two areas of change that I'd like to highlight, now, they weren't dramatically changed. I changed the titles. The titles I just gave you actually are reflecting the newer ones, which are a little bit more elaborate. But one change I made had to do with methodologies. So in 2001, I just assumed that all of the HRE would have learner-centered methods, and it would be discussion-oriented and have critical reflection. And I didn't go into any more detail than that. And also, I understand why I didn't, to be honest, because at that time I was working in Central Eastern Europe, and it was radical to have open-ended questions and discussions about human rights. It was enough. But over the years, as human rights education as a field has also grown and it's been used in different environments, and as I began also to think more about pedagogy, I ended up in this next version of the models to tease out different kinds or even tiers of methodologies related to HRE. And I don't think it's esoteric. So the first tier is participatory. And we know across all HRE and essentially for all education, we like to have engagement with learners directly in their own learning. Participation could be discussion oriented, it could be experience oriented, but it's basically around their engagement in the learning, participatory methodologies. And then there's, I would say, a certain kind of methodologies related to empowerment. I know that's jargon, but let me explain what I mean here. Here, I'm talking about methodologies that are included in this case, in HRE, that are oriented towards the development of certain skill sets that will be lingering, like critical reflection, right? So a lot of like the Freirean ideas of critical pedagogy might be related to this kind of what we're calling the second tier of empowerment. But the empowerment is is not necessarily related to something that I would call as a third kind of tier of pedagogy, which is transformation, where all that learning that you're doing, those critical analysis that you can do, and other maybe skill sets you learn related to sort of activist work maybe that it is oriented towards actual transformation, that it's applied, so that the orientation to the whole learning is for transformation, personal as well as social. So I'm not sure how articulate I just wasn't better on paper, to be honest with you, but basically I've moved beyond, in summary, from the participatory learner-centered to this kind of three-tiered, and they're related to one another. You can just begin with participatory, but you can also move into empowerment, but you can also move both of those into something explicitly related towards transformation. So I've elaborated on that more in this more recent version of the models. And the other thing I added really briefly is the critique of human rights itself, because I think as we've all become more familiar, or the critiques of human rights have been there since I started to do human rights education work. But I've increasingly felt, and maybe you have too, and maybe the listeners, I've increasingly felt that we need to really put it on the table, the critiques of human rights, as part of human rights education, so that we can have an honest discussion with our learners about the critiques, because that also creates not only an authentic learning environment, but it allows our learners to then think for themselves about to what degree they feel that human rights reflects the values that they want to assign to their agenda for social change, assuming that they're interested in social change. I just think it also makes everyone relax. So inside of the models now, I also have a description of or whether or not the critiques of human rights are included, and as part of the model. And I think, just to emphasize how important I think it is that we actually incorporate that into our HRE.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Felisa Tibbitts, one of the world's leading experts on HRE. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.